Ladies and gentlemen of Evolve, this is what you become if you don't evolve.
Yeah, that's right. I'm Alan Gilmer, the founder and ex-CEO and chairman of Inveris.
Hey guys, Chuck Yates here, Nimble Fatty. Never mind. All right, so we're doing the major wine flex. This is Bond. You guys have heard me talk about Bond, and when you look through and you see Harlan, arguably America's greatest Cabernet, their next level down is Bond. And if you'll see...
License to Kill.
License to Kill, I like that. They have a different name, so we're drinking St. Eden. It's got a different pastel circle. There are 5 of those, and I'm not going to get this right, but basically the different names, the different pastel circle is where the grapes are picked. So, you know, St. Eden here is like from a half an acre up, 1,500 feet up the mountain, another one from the valley. I actually like Bond better than I like Harlan.
This is my 8th glass, and I'm going to be lucky to be able to say hard consonants here. So
perfect.
You know, you've been in the very front of oil and gas, at least with the independents, for a long time. The independents were the guys that actually kind of drug the whole industry kicking and streaming to where we are today.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because you kind of have that classic private equity, smaller company, entrepreneurship, and there's no question those are the guys that figured out the shale. Because, I mean, you know, Mitchell, let's give Mitchell credit. I mean, he figured out the Barnett and how to make it work, but it really were these independents that went out and did it, and Aubrey really just bought that stuff. XTO bought that stuff, and it kind of got proved up. But you know, it was interesting. I think if you look at where shale actually fell apart, you know, because we went out there, we used new technology, we created it fell apart in terms of spacing. And so it was really the manufacturing, the next step up, that caused it to fall apart. And it was everybody. I mean, it was the small independents, nimble independents, all screwed up spacing. It was the larger oil and gas companies that all screwed up spacing. And so at the end of the day, you know, you kind of had this perfect storm of tons of capital, new technology, a classic bubble, if you will. And there's not an innocent person in the lot. You know, they all screwed up spacing.
Well, spacing was this critical component because that brought with it volumes, right?
Yeah.
So if you didn't have the spacing, you didn't have the volume that you were advertising. And then all of a sudden, it became very, very risky to, especially for public companies, to announce any kind of results of anything that they might be doing with regards to spacing, spacing experiments.
Right.
The kind of the super field or the super spacing locations, things like that. You know, if it didn't come out the way that they thought it was going to be, then you had this inordinate impact on your market cap. And what was interesting to me was reading the SPE articles and what people were doing and why they were doing it and things like that. The kind of those frac 3.0s, though, at the end of the day, really had only been applied to like 2% of the wells. There was this huge resistance to actually go try the things that might make it better.
Right.
Because all of a sudden it became too risky. You had all this money that was invested in these locations, and then it became too risky for guys that didn't know what they were doing to actually even drill a well. You know, right. So then you saw this kind of distillation to, I have the acreage, but damned if I'm going to drill a well because I've got to flip my acreage because all I can do is destroy value by testing it out, and if I don't know what I'm doing.
Well, you know, I mean, the joke is, right, the wedge isn't just a bad salad at a steakhouse, right? I mean, that was the whole thing, is you had valuations based on a wedge, and if you did anything to mess with that wedge, Even bigger was potentially a problem on that wedge. Because the thing that I realized that we screwed up, because if you look at what we were doing at Kane, and I got to be careful because this is Kane's data, not mine, but just in general, we had a 2019 drilling program that spent almost $1 billion that gave rates of return that everybody would find acceptable. They weren't acceptable given the dollar per acre that we had paid for. And what I figured out kind of in the soul searching of all that, because I found myself with a lot of time on my hands. But no, what I found out is when you get into, if you're going to drill the first horizontal well in a county, what you do is that first well, you spend all the dollars you need. Oh, is it 1,000 pounds of sand, 1,200 pounds of sand? Screw it, do 2,000. Let's not leave anything on the table. Let's not wonder what are the reserves here, right? So you do that. Maybe you put in, a couple of things of casing just to make sure you can get your frack away, because you don't want to, you don't want to go, we couldn't get the frack away because we didn't case it right, whatever. So you overspend on the front end to make sure you know what the reserves are, and then you optimize, right? So that's the mindset of proving up new acreage. It's exactly the opposite with spacing. And that's where I think we really screwed up was, and here's what I mean by this. If you think you're going to support 12 wells in this drilling unit, okay, we'll drill 12, and if we don't hit the EURs we think we're going to hit, well, that's okay. On the next one, we'll drill 10. The mindset actually should have been the opposite. It should have been, we think it's going to be 12, let's drill 6. Yeah. And let's see what happens. Because what we found in some of these plays, and this is crazy, you think the reserves are the reserves, and you divide by 12 wells, and that'll be your EUR per well. What we actually found in the mid-continent was if you drill 6 wells, the right number, you got, call it 100 of reserves. If you drill 8 wells, you didn't get 100 of total reserves, you got 75. It was like more straws went in there. You didn't get all of the milkshake out. And so that just devastated spacing because it was not linear as it turned out,
Well, that was the interesting thing to me was when we looked at those original oil in place efforts, where they would take the core and they would look at all those things in in every different basin, right?
Right.
And then they would come up, well, there's, how much per, in the Permian Basin had some ridiculous numbers, right? 150, $180 million barrels per square mile.
Right.
Because it's just so much rock, right?
Right.
A lot of it in areas where you couldn't really get at it, and then you had, like the Eagle Ford that was perhaps 6 to 10 million barrels per section. But then you ended up with this whole effort. Then it really, and those were real numbers. These it wasn't made up volumes. The issue is, how do you get it out of the ground? It's an engineering problem at that point, and so the perfect world would have been if you could go put a well in the ground, and you think about version 1.0 was, we're going to go try to create as big a disturbed rock volume as possible,
right?
Or whatever, fractured rock volume, disturbed rock volume. And so they're going to go frack the hell out of a few stages, and they're going to try to get 1,000-foot fracks out of there.
Right.
Well, of course, that was the worst idea possible because you busted the rock up, but you didn't bust it up very completely. It was just kind of poorly done. Then you started going into all these clusters, and then you started trying to break it up. The ideal thing was, at the end of the day, was if we could go into an area, and if we could grind the entire rock volume into sand,
right,
from the end of the wellbore to the beginning of the wellbore, for only a couple hundred feet out,
right.
Well, then you're going to be in great shape.
Right.
You're going to be able to really bust it all up. The problem was then you went into these areas where you already had 1,000-foot, these poorly conglomerated blocks where you busted them up for 1,000 feet every once in a while, and then you can't really. You're starting to just spend all your frac energy moving those blocks around rather than breaking them up.
Oh yeah, parent-child was a real issue.
The parent-child's a real issue, but I'm going to say that there was ways of dealing with it that we've gotten so scared of it because everybody is so worried about ever making a claim that you can create better dynamics for parent-child.
Right.
Because it just got it got slammed so heavily, rightfully so.
Yeah.
But the use of diverter agents was supposed to be the 3.0.
Right.
2% of the wells that were drilled during that 3.0 era used diverter agents. The idea being that you're going to bust up the rock and then you're going to start pumping diverter agents so that it's not going out, that it's just going to start breaking this stuff internally. And also to just keep it away from the old big fracks from the old 1.0 things in the first place. And it just seems like if you look at how much hydrocarbons we pulled out, it's a tiny fraction of what's really there.
Well, and so I have a theory, and this is like I always used to say before I ask any technical question in any board meeting. I'm just the dumb finance guy here. But the dumb finance guy, I always kind of wondered if our problem, like you're describing, didn't have to do with friction. And by that I meant we worried about busting that rock up, but at the end of the day, the stuff has to come out. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that friction inhibitors of some sort have to be a solution going forward because, at the end of the day, I mean, we all know friction stops stuff, And I just wonder if that's going to be 3.0 or maybe 4.0 or something.
Well, I remember the 1.0 deals was you had to have simple fractures, right? You couldn't go, you couldn't go, you couldn't really compete with Mother Nature in terms of the sigma 1, the direction of your stress fields and all that crap.
Right.
Bullshit.
Naturally induced fracture.
It was all, so you're going to go out and you always have to have linear fractures. Well, it never worked. And the ones that were more complicated worked better because it was just creating more places it was busting up more rock.
Right.
And, I thought that was, it was pretty fascinating. And I think the one thing that was really good about it in the early days was people really were experimenting.
Right.
And you could see it in the data. There was all sorts of, you could, whenever you're doing multilinear, you're looking at multilinear problems or multivariant problems that are nonlinear, you need to have a lot of experimental places in there so that you can model the surfaces, right?
Right.
And what you saw over time was that everything just kind of just kind of jammed over here. The only idea was we got to hit it harder, put more sand and put more lateral length in there.
Yeah.
And the lateral length, I really, everybody started getting, they were starting to say, well, lateral length didn't matter because it was, you were getting less returns per foot.
Right.
I was like, who cares? I mean, I don't care about returns per foot. So long as the returns per foot are still accretive in terms of the cost per foot.
Right.
And, and then all of a sudden you had a 10,000 foot lateral that is 100% rate of return relative to a 4,000 or 3,000 foot lateral that was a 6 or 7% rate of return. And that 10,000 foot lateral had a lot less reserves per foot, but the incremental cost of fracking and drilling that next 6,000 feet was incremental to the whole thing. It was moving away from the dollar aspect of it to this kind of more engineering KPIs that were interesting but not telling.
So I think the biggest culprit in all of this were public investors, and trust me, I'm going to defend them in just a second, but public investors measured companies on the basis of production growth, right? Yeah. Didn't care about rates of return, anything. It's just, what was production up? Oh, 12% quarter to quarter? Great. We love you and all that. And you got addicted to that as a public company in terms of, so am I going to experiment with 6 wells, even though I think 12 wells is the right spacing? I should figure this out. No, you drilled the 12 wells, and we all know that when you drill a well, man, IPs are big. Spacing doesn't matter until about month 4, 5, 6.
Well, when we were in our business and when we were doing, when drilling info and we were looking at all that stuff in a big way in Verus now. But
there you go.
But it was one of the things that was a given in our business was so long as your rate of return was 20% plus, you didn't care about taking a 20% plus rate of return and increasing it by 30%. You didn't want to take it, in fact, tripling it. You didn't care about taking from 30% to 80%,
right,
or to 90%.
right.
You just wanted to drill more wells. You just wanted to put as many as you could in there. It was only when that rate of return slipped to zero or minus that all of a sudden that tripling of it became really important.
Right.
And so, that we were comfortable. We got very comfortable, and there's a nonlinear human response to that return rate.
Well, it was interesting. So I was in kind of, call it closed door meeting, i.e. a bar, having a beer with a research analyst. And I go, dude, you have created crack cocaine, and it's called production growth, and you're feeding it to people. You're the crack dealer. And the research analyst said, I may be the crack dealer, but you don't have to smoke it, Chuck. And I was like, fair enough. But no, it really was that. I mean, I think it was, every oil and gas company just being valued off this wedge and not wanting to say anything about the wedge or deviate from the wedge assumptions led to exactly what you're saying. Let's just drill 12 wells per section.
Well, and also kind of destroying global, global demand growth. We're meeting it all here, and all of a sudden moving into a kind of a swing production point of view, in a way that scared the hell out of the rest of the world because it was completely uncontrolled.
Oh yeah, no doubt. So I gave a speech the other day talking about bubbles, and there was a bubble back in the mid-1800s for railroads in Great Britain. So like literally 90% of the railroads you see today in Great Britain, the track was laid back in the 1840s and the 1850s. And there was a stat, something like in 1852, for every railroad project in Great Britain, to get its money back, not even make money, every person on the island had to ride a railroad for 21 hours during the day. I mean, that was kind of what had happened about it. And so one of the Rothschilds had a great quote. It's my favorite investing quote. He said, there are three paths to ruin: wine, women, and engineers. The first two are a lot of fun, but the last one's the most certain. And I think
that was exactly what happened in the United States in the railroads, and that was, Morgan, House of Morgan was the ones that came in there and said, this cannot be, and I'm a free market libertarian guy, and yet at the end of the day, you got to sit there and say there was a way to, you overbuild something, you destroy the markets for the whole thing.
Yeah, no. And my thing about the engineers, and I don't want to say this because my ex-partners at Kane are great. Mike Hines is the best person on the planet. But man, engineers walk in and they show you a decline curve and they treat it as gospel. And you're sitting there 6 months later and you're going, okay, you said these were 35% rate of return wells. We have this much debt and this much PDP PV10. What happened?
It starts getting real. It starts getting real when the money is involved.
Yeah, exactly.
I remember I gave a talk to the energy minister in Argentina, and the questions that they all had were, how in the world did you go from two rigs to 200 in all these different basins in the period of a year? Because they were trying to figure out, well, we got the Vaca Muerta, we're going to have this, and how in the world did you do that? And I said, I started off the meeting in a poor way, and I realized I've said this internationally in untranslated ways in Asia and in South America, and it never went over well. I said, look, I do have to tell you that I'm a geophysicist by background, which means I'm going to lie to you.
Right.
But
particularly if I'm wearing a tie.
But we don't call it lying in engineering. In geophysics we call it pseudo truth. and there's like no smiles. They were just looking at it. You're like, oh God. He said he's going to lie to us.
Lighten up.
And I did it twice. You'd think I'd learn once, but twice in Korea, in front of like 1,000 Korean oil people. And I was thinking, well, at least they're oil people. They'll understand that geophysics is a soft science, right? And not a single smile. And I'm like, maybe I'm going to quit saying this one altogether. But I said it was really funny because I said, we do have engineers in the room, and they will tell you the truth because they'll tell you they're
Right.
telling you the truth.
Right.
And, the whole deal was we had rule of law, we had contracts that meant something, and people just waving $1 billion around, a lot of money
Yeah.
around, and there was not a single government economist involved in any of those decisions to go
Right.
from 2 to 200 rigs. And they were like, well, that just couldn't happen here. And that's, in reality, that's most of the world. It's like, unless you can go somehow prove to economists that it's going to work, then it's not going to happen.
I mean, it is the unique crucible, if you will, in the world, and that you have private ownership of minerals, because whatever that judge was years ago, Farmer Brown owns that shit, not the government. So you got private ownership of minerals, you got the most active capital markets on the planet. You have what I would have said at some point the most free market country on the planet. And yeah, you're right. That totally lives to that.
So I got a question for you. So
Yeah.
As we go into this future, because I have a definite opinion about this, but
All right. So
the
you're sandbagging me. I like it.
the concept of
Walking into it.
yeah.
Let's do it.
So the concept of oil and gas people, people that are producing oil and gas in the United States for
Yep.
any of these reservoirs, in terms of being able to meet the needs of a world that wants to decarbonize,
Right.
who do you think has the best chance of effecting decarbonization or relative decarbonization of any industry on the planet?
That's a good question, because I will step back. Everybody kind of says, oh, it's regulatory, ESG, it's the law and all that. No, it's not.
People wanting it.
It's companies, it's investors.
It's marketing. It's marketing.
Yeah.
It's public perception.
Yeah, no, it is a total tidal wave. I mean, my 18-year-old son, who has lived the best life of anyone on the planet, some are in Barcelona, some are in Cuba, some are in the Galapagos Islands. If you left him to his own devices and made him dictator for a day, first thing, boom, oil and gas is gone. I always tell him, I go, Charlie, you can put us all out of business tomorrow. How's that, Dad? Just stop using the stuff. That does it. But no, so you're right. So it is a wave that happens. So anybody that says, oh, this is just ESG and all that, it is real, it's happening and all that. Kind of thinking through who has the best way to navigate it. It's interesting because, you sit there and look at what BP's doing. Oh, we're going to go green and all this. Okay. You got Exxon going, well, we're going to pay our dividend, and you've got, and you've got the other big guys. Those folks can at least transition to it. What do you do if you're EOG? I mean, EOG is a really good operator, right? By all, they do oil and gas really well. If you're in the board of EOG and you're sitting there going, okay, what do we do given that maybe in 25 years we can't burn a hydrocarbon anymore? What do you do? Do you try to transition? I mean, you're a pretty big company. You've got some wherewithal. Do you try to do it? Do you say, screw it, we'll just ride it out? We're going to be the tobacco company, and when they smoke the last cigarette, we'll... But that's a great question, because I wouldn't want to be on the board of a $3 or a $5 billion oil and gas company today trying to figure that question out. So
Well,
who's your take?
So I'd say my take is 30 years is a long time, right?
Right.
And I certainly 80 years is an even longer time.
Right.
And I always try to put myself in the perspective of what people were talking about 100 or 80 years ago,
Yeah.
and how good of a decision they would have made for the future. And it was
Right.
always going to be disastrous, right?
Yeah.
So the future itself is always 10 or 20 years in the future. And that's what, to me, that's the investable future.
Right.
And with regards to the immediate needs of being able to drop greenhouse gas emissions,
Right.
because China's not going to do it,
Right.
India's not going to do
Right.
it, it's going to be the Western world, and the ones that are the best poised to be able to go do that, kind of double dipping in a lot of ways, is oil and gas companies. And I'd say that the majors for sure, but the large independents, Oxy, that's the one thing that I'll tell you, Oxy's taken a lot of hits on the chin
Right.
for the way that they finance things, the the buying of Anadarko and what have you. But on the other hand, I was at a talk about 2 years ago, and it was at the Permian Basin Study Group for SEG here in Houston. And there were 400 people in the room.
Right.
And I think I was still the chairman of the Texas Independent Producers and Royalty Owners. And so I had given a talk, and I was sitting there listening, and they had the vice president of downhole engineering, and she made an interesting comment. She said that the tiny fraction of wells that they had that were on gas lift was making a majority of their production in the Permian Basin.
Really?
And it was like 17% to 70%. It was that kind of comparison.
Oh, no way.
And I thought that is fascinating, because I guarantee you that's not a typical gas lift.
Yeah.
And it had to do with, is it an in situ huff and puff on the same wellbore? Is it,
right.
It's pushing gas back in there to remobilize the oil and what have you. And think about what that means in a world in which you're paid to dispose of carbon. Then all of a sudden you're getting paid both ways. And you're being able to produce more carbon, you're getting paid to do that. That's the reason the major oil companies across the board are all on board with the idea of that, and that's why it has to kind of come into some sort of, carbon exchange. The reason that they're pushing for carbon exchange, carbon trading, because they have the world's best methodology, because they're going to be able to make money getting paid to get rid of carbon.
Yeah.
And so it was interesting. So I tweeted this out, sitting there at the meeting, and 10 minutes later I get an email from TIPRO staff.
Okay.
And they said, "What in the hell did you just tweet, and where did you hear this?
And why?"
And they were like, "How did you hear this?" And I said, "The vice president of downhole engineering just told 400 people here."
Right.
So, I'm not breaking any kind of confidences or anything like that.
Yeah.
And what did that told me? It told me that they're extremely possessive of that information in a way that was interesting.
Right, somebody got to them.
And it got to them. And it was, and I have friends that have worked at Oxy, and it said the same thing. It was like they are so far ahead with regards to disposing of gas back into the reservoir, or cycling to be able to go pull it all out. And and that's always been interesting to me, because you look at the Eagle Ford, right? Eagle Ford was good along a knife edge of gas oil ratio.
Right.
And it dropped off horribly economically as you went down into the gas window, and then as you got up,
it was just dead as all get out.
Dead as, except for this one little field discovered early on over there in the Maverick Basin, that had 30 gravity crude, and that had wells that produced better than the ones on the sweet spot. And it was because it was natural fracs in that dead oil zone that were allowing themselves to get recharged.
Right.
And so to me, the whole concept of that whole issue of being able to utilize greenhouse gases that we might be pushing out, releasing the atmosphere, releasing them back into a reservoir to, as in situ secondary or tertiary production,
right,
is interesting, because that just means that all those reservoirs that we have can be cycled. And there's people that are playing around with that right now. But that whole concept of ESG, and you have to look at every situation and say, where can the money be made? And this one has got, the oil and gas industry has the pieces of where the money gets made. It's already there.
So let me play devil's advocate, and we'll get back old school, since you and I are the old guys. 70s Saturday Night Live. Jane, you ignorant slut. Here's the pushback on that.
I don't identify as Jane, by the way.
There we go. So I hear you on that, but what we are talking about money-wise to do that means the barrel gets produced out of Saudi Arabia. I mean, I think we have two fundamental problems here when we talk about decarbonization. Number one, no one is doing anything about consumption, right? I mean, look, John Kerry, he's flying his private plane. If it was really so bad, he wouldn't do it. Leonardo DiCaprio, if it really was bad, he wouldn't fly around. Al Gore, who, by the way, I've actually hung out and chatted with Al one day. Delightful guy. I actually enjoyed it. I think he's a sharp guy and all that. He's got, 5 houses, private planes and all that. If it was really that bad, it doesn't take carbon credits to get you to do less. You just should do less because it's bad, right? So that's one problem we have is that we're going to...
But changing behavior for that reason has never been a successful effort in the history of humankind, has it?
And that's exactly what I was going to say is name any other situation we've ever had where we attack the producer and we leave the consumer alone. Did it work in Prohibition? Did it work in the drug wars? No.
Hell no.
Hell no, exactly. So we have that problem. That's big problem number one. The second big problem we have is, and I hate to say this because
we're all the addicts. The problem is you can't, the reason you go after the producer is because there's fewer of them.
Right.
And all the voters are the ones that use it, and they're going to throw your ass out.
No, that's exactly right. It's like, if you really wanted to do this, throw a $500 a ton, $1,000 a ton carbon tax on everything and pay $12 at the pump. Voters don't like that, so they're not going to do that. So they're going to screw around with EPA admissions and stuff like that, right? So that's fundamental problem number one we have when we deal with this. Yeah, go ahead.
So a tax, so a carbon tax per se, which we already have. I would state that severance taxes are carbon tax because they're special.
Okay, I'll buy that.
They're special and no one else has to pay them, so
Right.
they are carbon tax, and they're a big one.
Yep.
And they get, at least you could sit there and say at least they're applied on the state level, which means they're used a little bit more wisely than they are on the federal level.
And they're in red states generally, so.
Yeah, so it's all.
Sorry, I'm just kidding.
But the whole gig is with regards to carbon tax or carbon credit. So there's all this back and forth, right?
Right.
And the reason that, and people are going to hate me for saying it, but the carbon credit is, if it's net carbon going in the atmosphere, why would you worry about the ones that cost, I call it the $1 million banana deals. Like if you're forced to eat bananas,
Right.
then I would much rather eat nickel bananas than $1 million bananas.
Okay.
And they run the gamut, right? So if you're going to do that, then let's figure out let's go out and look at the whole world. Let's look at the nickel bananas. Let's be serious about the whole thing. I mean, there was a great guy that gave this great presentation a few years ago at TIPRO, and he was a rancher. He was from San Antonio originally, but he's a rancher from Brazil, right?
Right.
And his passion was fighting the going into the rainforest and using the fires that they were doing to create crops and what have you.
Right.
And the idea of turning that into a cash situation where you would pay them not to go burn their crops.
Right.
And to be able to go do that. And what was fascinating was for a cost of $3 or $4 million, you could offset United States, maybe it was Southwest United States, but it was the complete industrial output
Right.
of carbon or greenhouse gases.
Right.
By keeping these fires at bay down in South America. And I was like, that's an interesting take. Why are we not talking about that?
And this is, let's go conspiracy theory. We'll do the JFK assassination, X-Files, whatever you want. I honestly believe that if you plant trees, in effect, what you're talking about, the decarbonization is way more than we're giving credit for.
Absolutely.
Because those numbers are never published. And we learned back at Rice, if somebody won't give you the raw data, it means they're lying to you or they're hiding, right? And so I think actually, ultimately, the solution is not to get rid of hydrocarbons, it's to decarbonize somehow. And God gave us trees. So Alan, you asked the question. Let me ask you the question. What do you wish today, Alan, and I'll go with today, Chuck, would be able to tell 25-year-old Alan or 25-year-old Chuck in terms of what did we f up, what did we miss, what should we have done differently, and in doing that, sprinkle in, what do we tell the 25-year-old guys today?
I think it's think about what people are going to be doing 10 years from now.
Okay.
Because in my career, I always knew what was going to happen 5 and 10 years from now. I just didn't have the money to do it. So as I worked towards that, I hit some waves right? But if I had been able to get ahead, and what I find today is that I'm not, I certainly do, I'm not the guy that knows what's coming 10 or 15 years from now.
Right.
I used to, but you get your gears get stuck in a certain place. But young people coming in have a clarity of things that are not yet, that aren't gumming the gears yet. And I think that it's just look at everything from a systems approach. I'm a big believer in systems approaches. What drives what? And right now, we don't have the technology to get rid of hydrocarbons, but that could change, and it could change tomorrow. And be open-minded with regards to where things coming from. But until that happens, the beautiful part about oil and gas business is it is a business in which an independent can get filthy rich, and it's an industry that that is really resistant to being kind of bought up by the big guys.
Yeah.
And it's nearly unique in the world that there's only X number of airlines and what have you. Oil and gas businesses, the cost of being able to manage an oil and gas asset lends itself to divesting to the next level down. And right now, if you take a look at the big companies that have been acquiring a bunch of things through now, they've announced that there's going to be $50 billion worth of divestment coming in the next year.
Right.
And it's because the 80-20 rule still works. And it will for a while. Now, with regards to pivoting and knowing where the next play is, I've always been a believer, just do what you're good at and understand that side of it and don't be a victim.
Yeah. So my take, and you and I both went to Rice, and at least my favorite professor, and I'm sure he's in your top 3, was a guy named Gilbert Cuthbertson, Doc C. And Doc claimed to be deaf. Oh, I can't hear you. He wasn't deaf, but he was a political science professor, and his theory was myth, power, value. And basically what that meant was you use myth to convert values to power. The example is George Washington and the cherry tree, right? George Washington supposedly chopped down the cherry tree. When his dad asked him, he said, "I cannot tell a lie. Yes, I did, Dad." And the whole thing, if you read history, that was a made-up story. That was made up for his campaign for presidency, right? It was a myth, but it took a value of honesty, converted it to power. If you're really cynical, you say politicians lie and all that. But I think the more kind of realistic, balanced way of looking at it is, no matter where you are in life, if you're a politician, if you're a business, if you're whatever, you really do need to control the narrative. Controlling the narrative is the single most important thing you can do. And the single most important thing I would tell 25 to 35-year-olds is control the narrative, because we haven't done it.
Goddamn,
these two old guys sitting right here, we have f***ed it up.
We've f***ed it up, and I'll double down on that. That's exactly right. We didn't do it. Think about it. We have a world in which all of us depend on things that people hate with a passion.
Right.
And it would be willing tomorrow to consign us to the dark age, to the Stone Age.
My son leading the charge.
Because of these things. That is someone else owning the narrative. That's someone that doesn't really, that it's appeal to their passion. It's appeal to the goodness. And that's the thing about it, is when you basically create the myth, to create the power of the narrative is always human betterment, or global betterment. hopefully global betterment doesn't mean that there's no humans on it. And right now that is kind of the separation over there. And I was very, very proud. Doc C's last paper on myth, power, value featured me.
Nice.
I don't know how, because I can't get at it, but
Yeah, no, and we did it to ourselves. I mean, this is mea culpa from two old guys sitting here. I mean, we used to publish bumper stickers that said "Let a Yankee freeze," and we did it because I think, this is my own personal opinion, through no value of our own, no action on our own, we became rich, right? The Saudis embargoed, oil went to $15 a barrel, we were rich. 3D seismic comes along, we found a bright spot, we became rich. I don't think we truly earned a lot of the wealth we had. There was a lot of luck involved. And it made us really arrogant. And instead of sitting there and educating folks, hey, here's what's in our frac fluid. It is water, it is sand, it is,
soap.
Yeah, it's basically soap. We sat there and said, screw Pennsylvania. We don't care. We're making money. And if I had, Blake Street Bomber came on my last podcast, 35-year-old, mid-30s-year-old guy. And one of the things he said was, I want my generation to take ownership of this business and do it in a better way than you guys did, Chuck. And I had to agree with him. Because we were not very, and look, I'm exhibit A on poster boy for being arrogant. I wear hoodies places and torn jeans and act all like this.
That's what I love about you, though, Chuck.
I appreciate that, but in terms of being...
My problem was I have a big fat neck and I hated wearing neckties.
But in terms of being humble, controlling the narrative, pointing at, as you say, pointing out the good, the single greatest thing that has happened to the planet in the last 300 years is the use of hydrocarbons. And the fact that we can't make that case, we screwed that up.
And fracking allowed us to go, has reduced greenhouse gas emissions in the only known way possible.
Yeah.
Incredible. And yet, that's not the truth that's known.
Yeah, and we've given the narrative away. So if I had a message for the 25-year-old to 35-year-old out there, let's get a hold of the narrative. Let's do it being humble. Look to Sam Walton. You look at Fayetteville, Arkansas, they were making so much money off that stock, yet no one had an obnoxious house. They were very humble. That's why Walmart became as big as it did, and we ought to adopt that example.
And that old truck. It was interesting. Scott Tinker, I've worked with Scott. My first job with Marathon, the research lab, was Scott Tinker was a brand new PhD, just got out of Colorado, University of Colorado, and was over there. And we've been friends forever. His wife was selling insurance to all of us because she was the only pretty girl selling insurance to any of us over at a research lab, right? But Scott has a statement, and he runs the Switch Energy project, and I encourage everyone to give heavily to that because it's nonpartisan. It talks about energy. It talks about what's involved in terms of moving to a non-carbon future, and he made a statement that I thought was beautiful. He said, oftentimes, he goes, advocates for various different sides are completely factual, but they're rarely factually complete. And he said the truth is in both of those, is combining both of those, and that you can lie. You can be completely factual and lie like a dog.
Right.
But being factually complete is where the truth is.